looking at Psalm 35. If you're joining us, maybe missed the first sermon, either here or by way of technology, we are dividing Psalm 35 into two parts due to the length of the psalm, and we're titling this A Plea for Divine Retribution. We pointed out already that to some extent we all have enemies. We may not even be aware of them, especially on a national level, and we certainly need to be mindful of, on a spiritual level, the devil is enemy number one. And we're looking at a text where David is addressing God, pleading with God to deal with the enemies that he has. And again, the emphasis here is that David wants God to take retribution. He's not going to take matters into his own hands. He's not going to take vengeance. Of course, as we know in the New Testament, vengeance belongs unto God, and this certainly would be applicable to us today to remember that it is God who does the getting even, not we ourselves. We come now to the third point in the psalm, and that is David's accusation, looking at verses 11 through 18. Notice that David's enemies reward evil for good. David has tried to do them good. In turn, they give him evil. Notice verse 11. False witnesses did rise up. They laid to my charge things that I knew not. And once again, we go back to a scene that's reminiscent of a courtroom. David's enemies are false witnesses. They are not telling the truth. In our language today, we would say they're guilty of perjury. They're lying. Malicious, slanderous accusations are made against David. Some might have been telling King Saul, well, David is out to get you. He's trying to assassinate you. He's trying to take your throne away, whispering these into the ears of an already insanely jealous king, and that just fuels his anger that much more. These are all false witnesses leveling false accusations. Notice they're saying things about David he didn't even know about. They laid to my charge things that I knew not. They're accusing me of things about which I know absolutely nothing because, again, the accusations simply are not true. Verse 12, they rewarded me evil for good to the spoiling of my soul. And this has to be a deep hurt. He's being injured by the very ones he's helped in the past. Be like stopping to help somebody change a flat, and it's happened only to have the one rob you. You helped him change a flat tire, and he in turn robs you, and it has happened before. That is returning and rewarding evil for good. Watched an episode on, I forget which channel it is, Cold Case Files, and it was an episode about two very close friends, young men who were very close friends. They spent time together. They did a lot of hunting together. Well, lo and behold, one turned on the other and killed his best friend. That's rewarding evil for good. And you wonder why. And the episode pointed out that they both went duck hunting and both had waders on. And he pushed his friend into the water thinking he would drown. Normally, if you had waders on, you fall in the water, you're going to sink because you can't get them off in time. But he didn't sink. His friend swam to a stump and held on, screaming for help. And so this fellow in the boat just comes over and shoots him in the back of the head. Why would somebody do that? A best friend to a best friend? Well, he was after his best friend's wife, is why he did that. And that is evil. That is rewarding evil for good. And that's what David's enemies are trying to do to him. Notice how David had helped these in the past. But as for me, when they, that is my enemies, were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. Wearing sackcloth was a sign of grief. When they were hurting, I grieved for them. I didn't rejoice. I humbled my soul with fasting. I did without. I prayed to God for them. But my prayer returned into my own bosom. I was blessed by praying, but they weren't changed, though, as a result of my prayers. That reminds us that prayer does not override anybody's personal will. Their will was to remain an enemy, even though David had been praying for them. Notice verse 14. I behaved myself as though he had been my friend or brother. When they were down, I consider them a friend or brother who was down. I bowed down heavily as one that mourns for his mother. I was as concerned about them as I would have been concerned about my own mother if she were sick, or if she had died, or she had problems. I was very much concerned. My heart broke for you when you were in trouble, and now you're trying to kill me. That is rewarding evil for good. Second, they actually rejoiced that David was hurting. Verse 15. But in mine adversity, they rejoiced. When I was down, they were happy. They didn't mourn. They didn't pray. They gathered themselves together. The abjects, the adversaries, the attackers gathered themselves together against me. I knew it not. They did tear me and ceased not. Again, the ones who had been the object of David's prayers and help receive the news of David's distress with joy. They laugh at him. They laugh at him when he's down. They gather together to watch David struggle with trouble. As spectators at a sporting event, David has become their entertainment. His hurt brings them happiness. And I think cold-hearted might be an apt description of these opponents. Cold-hearted, callous individuals. Verse 16. With hypocritical mockers in feast, or like godless jesters at a feast, they gnashed upon me with their teeth. In other words, engaging in this wickedness is fun for them, like going to a party. They gnashed upon me, a metaphor for violent criticism, comparable to a lion chewing up his prey. They tear David's reputation into pieces, again loving every minute of it. Now, friends, this does not speak well of them. This is no reflection on David. It is a bad reflection on them. But if we ever get to the point where we enjoy cutting others, cruelly treating others when they are hurting, we've lost every ounce of both compassion and Christianity. We're not fit to be called children of God if we start acting like that. That's how they're acting. We've often heard it said, blowing out somebody else's candle doesn't make yours burn any brighter. They're trying to blow David's candle out, but their light's not burning any brighter whatsoever. Verse 17. Lord, how long wilt thou look on? It is as if David is saying, God, stop looking. Start acting. I know you see what's happening. I know you know what's happening. And it could be that David is getting just a bit frustrated that God hasn't already stepped in and handled the situation. Don't just sit there, God. Don't keep looking. Start acting. Do something. Bring my grief to an end. We think about somebody else who was hurting. We think about Job. Job asked the question, why is this happening to me? David's asking another question here. He's asking, when is it going to end? When are you going to do something about it? Stop looking, start acting. Rescue my soul from their destructions, my darling from the lions. The lions will be a figurative use for strong ones. These enemies of David are lions. They are strong ones. He cannot defeat them on his own. Now, we said at the outset that the background to this may very well be when Saul was out to kill David. And again, we studied that in 1 Samuel. Adam led us in that study. If that be the case, there's a lot that went on behind the scenes that we didn't read about specifically in 1 Samuel. And of course, we know that God did not record in His Word every hurt and every bit of harm that happened to anybody, including David. But the point is, not only did Saul hurl javelins at David, he also hurled bad words and false accusations in an attempt to end David's life. Again, this section ends with a vow of praise. David says, let me stop for a moment. Let me gather my thoughts and pause and praise. And that's verse 18. I will give thee thanks in the great congregation. I will praise thee among much people. God, whatever your decision is, if you just want to keep on looking, well, that's your prerogative. I want your help. I need your help. But whatever the outcome, I'm not going to stop praising you and giving you glory. I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, as we sing. He would sing the same song. I'm willing to do this before throngs of people, before crowds of people. He knows that blaming God is not the answer. That's what a lot of folks do when life doesn't go their way. They blame God. They turn from God. David's the exact opposite. No blaming God, but praising God. I'm going to stay with God. And may we do likewise. Notice in the fourth point, David's allegiance to God. First of all, he seeks God's vengeance on the ungodly. Verse 19. Let not those who are my enemies wrongfully rejoice over me. Neither let them wink with the eye that hate me without a cause. The word rejoice in this verse is also translated gloat. We know what it means to gloat, to feel superior, to look down upon another. They would wink with the eye at David, again at David's destruction. These people are hatred personified. They are eaten up with hatred for a man. And again, the bewildering thing is there's no reason for their hatred. David has not harmed them in the least. But if we're not careful, we can likewise be consumed with hate, and it never helps. You may be familiar with the killer known as BTK, Dennis Rader, who lived in Wichita, Kansas, who went on a killing spree for years, finally accosted and arrested in 2005. Probably would not have been, but he sent a computer disk to the police station. He asked them beforehand, there's no way you can trace this computer disk to me if I send it, is there? And they said, well, no, we can't trace it, knowing all the while they could. And they did, and they finally caught him. And he was just an evil man, but sometimes we forget about the man's family, who had no clue he was doing all this killing. A reporter interviewed his daughter, and she said, you know, my dad in the home was the nicest man you would ever meet. He was the kindest father. Now, he had his moments, but he never hurt us. He never threatened us. He was a Cub Scout leader. He was a leader in the church where he attended. He was a pillar of the community. He was a hard worker. And people were just amazed that he is a serial killer, and especially his own family. And his daughter said in the interview, she said, you know, for years, I was just consumed with hatred for him. I mean, what he did, the hurt he inflicted on all these people, the sheer embarrassment he has brought to our family and the hurt he's caused us. But she said, you know what? I just finally learned to forgive him, not gloss over what he did, but I finally learned for my own sanity, I'm just going to have to forgive him and go on. And again, she realized that hatred was absolutely eating her alive. And she said, I've got to give this up. Well, these enemies of David have no reason for hating him, but they have no remorse for their hatred either. It's consuming them, and they're glad to let it happen. Verse 20, they do not speak peace. I would love to shake hands and bury the hatchet, David says. They're not wanting peace. There's not much you can do with people who are not wanting peace. They, in fact, devise deceitful matters against them that are quiet in the land. This is a reference to David. David's not seeking Saul's throne. In fact, he's hiding in the wilderness. He's the one quiet in the land, but they still will not leave him alone. They continue pestering him as they pursue him at the aid of Saul. Verse 21. They open their mouth wide against me, again leveling these horrible things, saying, aha, our eye has seen it. We witnessed David committing these crimes. These accusations, they're true. We back them up. All the while, they're lying. And so David seeks God's vengeance then on the ungodly. God's vengeance, not David's, but God's. In the handout, there's a misprint, a glaring misprint. There is an "un" that ought not be there, so mark out the "un." First of all, David did seek vengeance on the ungodly, but here he seeks vindication on the godly, or of the godly. Vindication of the godly. And that's verses 22 through 26. Verse 22, thou hast seen, O Lord. Again, going back to the other verse, stop looking, start acting. Keep not silence, O Lord, be not far from me. David knows that God has an all-seeing eye. God knows everything, God sees everything. Now to the wicked, that can be a frightening thought. But to the faithful, those who are trying to live for the Lord, that is a comforting thought, knowing that God does know and that God does see our plight and that God in heaven is concerned about what happens to his people down here on the earth. O Lord, be not far from me. David knew that God's nearness meant God's protection. James says, draw near to God. He'll draw near to you. That's what David's doing here. We sing, nearer my God to thee. Nearer, still nearer. We want to be close to God because closeness to God, of course, means God's protection. And then verse 23, wake up. It is as if David is speaking to a sleeping giant. Stir up, wake up to my judgment, even to my cause, my God and my Lord. Act, another word. The imagery, again, of waking God up, though God never sleeps. It seems that way to David. Do something for me. 24. Judge me, O Lord my God, according to thy righteousness. David knew that truth is God's standard of evaluation, God's righteousness. Let them not rejoice over me. Folks, in the final analysis, all that ultimately matters is what God thinks of us. Doesn't matter what he thinks or she says. All that matters is what God thinks about us. And I hope that we never forget that. No matter what men may say or think, all that matters is what God's judgment of us is. Judge me in, not according to what they're saying, but thy righteousness. 25, let them not say in their hearts, ah, so would we have it. Let them not say, we've swallowed him up. The wicked would love to say, they'd give anything to be able to say, we're the ones who brought about David's downfall. We're the ones who took David's life from the earth. Don't let them say that, is David's plea. 26, instead let them be ashamed. They ought to be ashamed of the way they're acting. Let them be ashamed and brought to confusion, together that rejoice at my hurt. Let them be clothed with shame and dishonor that magnify themselves against me. Let them be clothed. The word clothed, be clothed with anything is to be overwhelmed in this language. So to be clothed here is to be, let them be overwhelmed with shame, dishonor, and disgrace. But again, the prayer is for God to handle this. David says, I'm not going to. I'm going to give the matter and my enemies over to God. Once again, hits the pause button before he ends, and there is a vow of praise. 27 and 28. When God steps in and God handles situations, well, let them shout for joy and be glad that favor my righteous cause. Let them say continually, let the Lord be magnified. Everybody was not against David. He had his allies. As we've studied the books, there were those who did stay with David, even though many turned against him. Well, these would join David in praise. Let the Lord be magnified, which has pleasure in the prosperity, not the adversity, but the prosperity of his servant. My tongue shall speak of thy righteousness and of thy praise all the day long. When God handles dilemmas, good people can then rejoice. And that's what's happening here. But when we take matters into our own hands, we only compound our problems and really stoop to the level of the enemy in so doing. That's what the enemy wants us to fight back. That's what the enemy wants. God says, let me handle this. Now, we want to wrap up there are lots of points of application. We'll just note a couple here. First of all, and you may have experienced this yourselves, some of the very worst pain can be when friends, for whatever reason, become enemies. That is a hurt. Ask David of these who were once friends. King Saul was once an ally, a friend of David. You may remember that when David played the music before Saul, that Saul said, "You know what, David, won't you come live with me? I don't want you going back to Jesse. I don't want you going back to the sheep. I don't want you going back home. My home is your home now. Stay with me." And David did. And they had good times together. And they fought battles together. But of course we know that Saul became insanely jealous of David. The once friend is now an enemy, an avowed enemy, out to kill who was once his friend. Ask Jesus of Judas, of a friend turning traitor and becoming enemy. One of his hand-picked apostles betrayed the Lord with a kiss. Honoring God is easy when encouraging friends are around us, when things are going well, when we're not consumed with problems. In those times we can pray fervently and sing wholeheartedly, but the true test of faith comes when friends become enemies, when problems mount, when we ache with pain. Then we can identify with hurting, and then we need God more than ever. But if you've experienced a friend becoming an enemy, you know the hurt that David has here. Second, let's think about praying for our enemies today. And we've emphasized this already, but we want to emphasize as we close. Keep in mind the time frame in which David lived. He lived before Jesus died on the cross. He did not have the example of forgiving enemies as we have in Jesus. Keep in mind, of course, that David is praying for God to handle all of this. Today we have the example of Jesus. We have the teaching of the New Testament that we are not to take matters into our own hands. We are not to retaliate. We are to know that vengeance belongs unto God. So note that distinction between Psalm 35 and when we live today. We are to pray for those who persecute us. That's part of the Sermon on the Mount. And again, that's the teaching of Jesus. We are to pray for our enemies. As we do, let us remember who the real enemy is. Let us see the real enemy. Behind all evil people and behind all evil ways is the devil. The devil is the real enemy. He has been since day one of his place here on the earth. And our real battle then is with the prince of darkness. And when we see people under his spell or in his hands acting wrong and doing wrong, maybe against us, remember that ultimately he's the reason. That's no excuse for them, but ultimately he's the one behind the hurt. We think about enemies, a good thing to pray for would be their conversion. Pray for their conversion. Is that not the essence of Jesus' prayer on the cross? When he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Father, if these folks knew they were killing God, they wouldn't be doing it. In essence of what Jesus is saying, and so forgive them. Jesus' prayer was answered in Acts 2. When many of those there on Pentecost had been there at the foot of the cross, had been responsible for crucifying Christ, obeyed the gospel. Peter pointed his finger in their chest and said, "You've taken Jesus. You crucified the Lord and God." They repented, they were baptized, and then they were forgiven, and then Jesus' prayer for their forgiveness was answered. Pray for their conversion. And keep in mind that before our conversion, we also were enemies of God in our sinful state. Third, as we think about enemies and our interactions with enemies, let us pray that whatever our reaction, we never hurt God's cause. Never ever hurt God's cause. If we, whenever we're wronged, retaliate with bad words or with bad actions, we hurt not only ourselves, but we also hurt the cause of God. We hurt our influence when we act like the enemy. We will never convert an enemy to Christ if we act like that enemy. We will never convert the world to Christ if we act like the world. It will never, ever happen. And so, a plea for divine retribution. Now, this is all easier said than done, and it's easier preached than lived. And I may need reminding of all this tomorrow. Who knows? You can have an enemy just driving down the road these days, and somebody speeds up and cuts you off. You have to slam on your brakes. The temptation is to speed up, blow your horn, flash your lights, pass him if you can. I try to not do that. I'm not an aggressive driver. My family will amen that. I'm not an aggressive driver. They say my sin is driving too slow. But I'm a very defensive driver, and if somebody wants to speed around me to get ahead of me, go for it. If you get there a minute before I do, more power to you. But I'm just going to take my time and try not to get involved in this road rage or get an enemy that way or any way for that matter. But again, easier said than done. David reminds us that ultimately with God we cannot fail. Ultimately, we're not going to fail with God. Doesn't mean we won't have setbacks now and enemies now, but ultimately we're not going to fail with God. Without God, we cannot succeed ultimately. And so the question, are you with God? Have you obeyed the gospel? Have you been baptized into Jesus as a penitent believer confessing Christ? If not, we'd be glad to baptize you this day. If you need prayers of the church, your sins of a public nature, we'd be glad to pray publicly for you. Privately, just go to God in prayer. As you repent, He promises that He will forgive. A couple of final comments. Regarding our response to enemies, first of all, to return evil for good is demon-like. Demon-like. This is what some of those in David's day did to him. He did them good, they did him evil. Even most worldly people do not stoop to returning evil for good. Most worldly people return evil for evil. That is manlike. That is the typical response. That is getting even. That is retaliation. If you're kind to me, then I'll be kind to you. If you mistreat me, I'll mistreat you and then some. That's the typical worldly reaction. That's not God's will for us. To return evil for good is demon-like. To return evil for evil is manlike. But to return good for evil, now we're where we need to be. That is God-like. When we do that, praying for an enemy, even helping an enemy, even doing good to an enemy, that tells us now we're on higher ground. And now we have Jesus living in us. And may God help each of us to act accordingly. Respond if you need to as we stand and sing.